This channel examines the Jeffrey Epstein case using court documents, public records, and verified reporting. We do not speculate. We do not accuse. We document what exists, and what remains unanswered. Everything presented here is drawn from publicly available sources. This is not a theory channel. This is the file. Before it became a headline, before it became shorthand for scandal, it was simply an aircraft. A private jet. A tail number. A flight plan. Over time, one of the planes associated with Jeffrey Epstein acquired a nickname that would echo across media coverage for years. That nickname, repeated in documentaries, court filings, and public debate, transformed an aviation asset into a cultural symbol. But this series is not about symbolism. It is about timeline. Because when we strip away myth and focus strictly on documented movement, a clearer picture begins to form. Epstein owned or used multiple aircraft over different periods. The most frequently discussed was a Boeing 727 used during the 1990s and 2000s. Later, he also used other jets, including Gulfstream models. Publicly released flight logs stem primarily from specific years and specific aircraft, not necessarily every flight he ever took. That distinction matters immediately. When people say, Epstein's plane, they often imagine a single aircraft with a complete, continuous passenger history. The reality is more fragmented. The logs most often cited in media coverage were introduced in civil litigation and later circulated widely. They document departure and arrival locations, dates, passenger names as recorded by pilots, crew entries. They do not record the purpose of travel, duration of stay at destination, private interactions on board, events occurring after landing. So before we begin mapping the timeline, we establish one rule. A flight entry confirms transportation, nothing more. Now we turn to chronology. The documented flights span the 1990s into the mid-2000s, with recurring routes between New York, Palm Beach, Florida, Santa Fe, New Mexico, the U.S. Virgin Islands. These were locations tied to Epstein's known residences. Patterns begin to emerge. Not accusations. Patterns. Certain routes appear frequently. Certain names recur during specific periods. Some years show heavier travel than others. But to understand what the timeline reveals, we must reconstruct it year by year. Because without sequence, speculation fills the gaps. The 1990s are often referenced in discussion, but rarely examined chronologically. When we look at the available flight logs from that decade, one thing becomes clear. The early entries reflect infrastructure before scandal. At this stage, Epstein was publicly known as a wealthy financier with elite social access. Media scrutiny was minimal. The allegations that would later define his name had not yet entered national headlines. And the flight patterns reflect that era. Recurring routes. During the 1990s, documented routes frequently connected. New York, Epstein's primary residence and financial base. Palm Beach, Florida, another major residence. Santa Fe, New Mexico, his ranch property. The U.S. Virgin Islands, later associated with his private island holdings. These routes form the backbone of the known timeline. Flights between New York and Palm Beach appear repeatedly, suggesting regular movement between seasonal residences. Travel to New Mexico and the Caribbean appears more episodic but recurring. What the logs show during this period is mobility, not yet controversy. Early passenger entries. In the 1990s entries, the passenger lists are often shorter and less populated with globally recognizable political names compared to some early 2000s flights. Instead, we see associates, employees, assistants, occasional social contacts. Some names that would later become high-profile appear sporadically in this period. Others do not appear until later years. That timing is significant. Because when analyzing presence, the first appearance of a name matters as much as the number of appearances. Context of the era. In the 1990s, Epstein had not yet faced the 2008 non-prosecution agreement. There was no 2019 federal indictment. Public awareness of allegations was extremely limited. Therefore, interpreting these flights requires chronological discipline. A 1996 entry cannot be judged through the lens of 2019 revelations without acknowledging that the broader public, including many in elite circles, did not have the same information at the time. Growth of the network. As the decade progresses, the logs suggest expansion. Flights become slightly more frequent. Passenger diversity increases. Destinations stabilize around core properties. The aircraft becomes a logistical connector between Epstein's residences and his social network. But at this stage in the timeline, the logs remain what they are: movement records. There is no visible spike, no dramatic anomaly in these early years, at least not within the scope of publicly released aviation data. The significance of the 1990s is foundational. They establish baseline patterns. They show how the infrastructure operated before public scandal altered perception. If the 1990s established the infrastructure, the early 2000s expanded the spotlight. This is the period most frequently cited in public debate. The logs from roughly 2000 to 2005 contain several names that would later dominate headlines. Flights during these years often connected New York, Palm Beach, the U.S. Virgin Islands, and international destinations. And it is here that perception begins to shift. The appearance of recognizable names. Among the most discussed entries are flights involving former U.S. President Bill Clinton. Publicly released logs confirm that Clinton traveled on Epstein's aircraft multiple times in the early 2000s. Many of these trips were reported as part of humanitarian initiatives in Africa after Clinton left office. What the logs confirm: dates, routes, passenger entry. What they do not confirm: the purpose beyond transportation, knowledge of wrongdoing, activities outside the aircraft. Clinton has publicly stated that he was unaware of Epstein's criminal conduct at the time of those trips. The timeline shows repeated travel during this window, particularly between 2002 and 2003. Chronologically, this is before the 2008 plea agreement that brought wider attention to Epstein's conduct. That timing matters. International routes. This era also includes more varied destinations. Some logs reference international travel, including trips connected to philanthropic or diplomatic contexts. The aircraft during this period functioned not only as domestic transport but as international mobility infrastructure. The expansion of routes corresponds with Epstein's increasing visibility in elite social and philanthropic circles. Density of travel. Compared to the 1990s, the early 2000s logs show increased flight frequency, larger passenger lists on some entries, more recognizable public figures. But again, the records remain administrative. They list names as recorded by pilots, often handwritten, sometimes abbreviated. The logs do not differentiate between primary guests, staff, family members, security personnel. So while the early 2000s represent the most scrutinized period in hindsight, the documentation itself does not expand in narrative detail. It expands in visibility. The retrospective effect. After Epstein's 2019 arrest and death, this era was re-examined intensely. Flights that once appeared philanthropic were reconsidered under a different lens. But the sequence remains fixed. These flights occurred before the 2008 agreement. They occurred before the 2019 federal indictment. Chronology does not erase questions. But it anchors interpretation. As we enter the mid-2000s, the timeline approaches a turning point. Publicly, Epstein was still operating within elite circles. Privately, scrutiny was beginning to build. The period between 2004 and 2008 is critical. Not because the flight logs suddenly reveal something dramatic, but because this window precedes the controversial 2008 non-prosecution agreement in Florida. When analyzing this stretch chronologically, three elements stand out. 1. Continued core routes. Flights continue to circulate between New York, Palm Beach, the U.S. Virgin Islands, New Mexico. The pattern remains consistent with earlier years. There is no abrupt collapse in travel frequency visible in the released logs before 2008. If someone were expecting a sudden drop-off in aviation activity immediately before legal scrutiny intensified, the available records do not clearly demonstrate that. The aircraft still functioned as connective infrastructure between residences. 2. Passenger density shifts. By the mid-2000s, the number of high-profile public names appearing in logs appears to decline compared to the early 2000s peak. This does not necessarily indicate awareness or distancing. It may reflect shifting social circles, changing schedules, or incomplete documentation. But from a purely chronological perspective, the density of widely recognized political names appears heavier in the 2001 to 2003 window than in the immediate pre-2008 years. Again, that observation describes patterns, not intent. 3. The legal clock ticking. In 2005, local investigation activity in Florida began gaining traction. By 2006, a grand jury indictment on state charges occurred. These events would eventually lead to the 2008 agreement. Yet when reviewing flight entries from this period, the logs themselves do not explicitly reflect visible disruption tied to legal escalation. This is important. The aviation timeline does not provide a dramatic, warning flare before the deal. There is no obvious spike or disappearance that signals the legal storm forming in the background. The aircraft kept flying. And that continuity is telling. Because it demonstrates a separation between legal processes unfolding quietly and the outward appearance of normalcy within Epstein's travel schedule. Then, 2008 arrives. The non-prosecution agreement allowed Epstein to plead guilty to state charges while avoiding federal prosecution at that time. The deal would later become one of the most criticized aspects of the entire case. From a timeline perspective, this is the hinge. Flights before 2008 belong to the pre-deal era. Flights after 2008 occur in a world where allegations are no longer obscure. That shift will define how later entries are interpreted. 2008 was not the end. It was a legal milestone, but not a disappearance. After entering the controversial non-prosecution agreement in Florida, Jeffrey Epstein pleaded guilty to state charges and served a short sentence that included work release privileges. The deal drew criticism years later, but at the time, it did not remove him permanently from elite social circulation. So what does the flight timeline show after 2008? 1. A noticeable shift in visibility. Publicly released flight logs are denser in the pre-2008 years. After the plea agreement, documentation becomes less frequently cited in media reporting. This does not necessarily mean flights stopped. It means that the most widely circulated logs stem primarily from earlier periods and specific aircraft. Epstein continued to travel after his conviction. However, the aircraft most associated with the Lolita Express nickname was reportedly sold in later years, and other jets were used. This introduces fragmentation. When people examine the flight logs, they are often looking at a defined slice of time, not a comprehensive record of all aviation activity post-2008. 2. Social distancing or social persistence. After 2008, some public figures distanced themselves from Epstein. Others maintained limited social contact. Public reporting in later years documented meetings, including those occurring well after the conviction. One example frequently cited in broader discussions, though not central to the earlier flight logs, is Bill Gates, who acknowledged meeting Epstein years after the 2008 conviction. Gates later stated those meetings were a mistake in judgment. Importantly, discussions about post-2008 associations often involve meetings or social visits rather than the specific early 2000s flight logs that dominate online debate. This distinction matters. The Lolita Express narrative is heavily anchored in pre-2008 documentation. Post-2008 analysis requires separate evidence streams, emails, meeting records, property visits, not just aviation manifests. 3. The illusion of closure. Because 2008 resulted in a conviction, some assume that elite association immediately ceased. The timeline does not support a clean break. Epstein remained wealthy. He retained property. He continued to travel. The difference was perception. After 2008, any documented association carried heavier reputational risk. Meetings that might have been overlooked in 2002 became controversial in 2011. Chronology shapes reaction. 4. The quiet years before 2019. Between 2009 and 2018, Epstein largely operated outside intense national spotlight. Media coverage existed, but it was not yet the global firestorm that would follow in 2019. Flight activity during this era is less publicly dissected, not necessarily because it ceased, but because fewer logs were introduced in widely circulated legal proceedings during that time. The timeline, therefore, has a structural gap. And gaps invite speculation. But speculation must not replace documented evidence. By the time 2019 arrived, the aviation narrative had already solidified in public memory, even though much of the focus remained anchored in flights from nearly 2 decades earlier. July 2019. Federal authorities arrested Jeffrey Epstein at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey after he returned from Paris on a private jet. That image, law enforcement waiting at a private aviation terminal, reignited global attention on his aircraft history. But here is the critical question. Did the 2019 federal indictment center on the Lolita Express flight logs? The answer is more restrained than many assume. 1. What the 2019 indictment focused on. The federal charges filed in 2019 focused primarily on alleged sex trafficking of minors, victim testimony, financial transactions, physical evidence recovered from properties. The indictment did not rely primarily on the historic flight logs that dominated public discourse. This distinction is important. The logs were part of the broader documentary universe surrounding Epstein, but they were not the backbone of the 2019 prosecution strategy. Investigators prioritize evidence tied directly to criminal conduct, not simply transportation history. 2. The arrest and aviation symbolism. Epstein's arrest at a private airport revived the aircraft narrative instantly. Private aviation already carried symbolic weight in this case. The idea of exclusive travel, sealed cabins, and elite passengers fed public imagination. But from an evidentiary standpoint, the act of arriving by private jet in 2019 did not retroactively transform earlier flight entries into proof of misconduct. The timeline remained what it always was: a sequence of documented movements. The difference was emotional intensity. 3. The search warrants. When federal agents executed search warrants at Epstein's properties in 2019, they seized digital devices, photographs, and physical documents. Public reporting focused heavily on what was found in residences, not on aircraft manifests. Again, this underscores a central theme of this entire series. Flight logs provide context. They do not provide narrative detail of alleged crimes. 4. The death that changed perception. In August 2019, Epstein died in federal custody. The official ruling was suicide. But for many members of the public, the circumstances fueled deep suspicion. Trust in institutions, already fragile, deteriorated further. And when trust collapses, documentary artifacts gain amplified meaning. The flight logs, which had circulated for years, were suddenly treated as if they were hidden keys to a suppressed conspiracy. Yet the documents themselves had not changed. They still showed dates, routes, names. Nothing more. 2019 did not expand the content of the flight logs. It expanded their symbolic power. At the center of the timeline stands a machine. Not a person. Not a document. A Boeing 727. The aircraft most closely associated with the nickname Lolita Express was a Boeing 727, a large tri-engine jet more commonly used by corporations or governments than private individuals. Its size alone distinguished it from smaller executive jets. And that size mattered. Because visually and psychologically, a Boeing 727 feels different from a Gulfstream. It feels industrial, capable of carrying many passengers, symbolic of scale. But symbolism and documentation are not the same. 1. The aircraft's operational reality. The Boeing 727 used by Jeffrey Epstein during the 1990s and early 2000s functioned as long-range private transport. It connected New York, Palm Beach, Santa Fe, the U.S. Virgin Islands, international destinations. It required a full crew. It required maintenance teams. It required regulated flight planning. This was not an invisible craft operating outside aviation oversight. Every departure and landing left records within FAA systems. The nickname, however, stripped away that operational context. It turned a regulated aircraft into a narrative device. 2. The power of a name. The phrase, Lolita Express, did not originate as an official designation. It emerged in media coverage and public commentary, referencing Vladimir Nabokov's novel Lolita, a cultural shorthand implying exploitation of youth. Once attached, the nickname permanently altered perception. From that moment forward, the plane was no longer transportation. It was implication. Every flight entry began to feel loaded, even though the logs themselves remained neutral records. This is a powerful example of linguistic framing. Change the label, and you change the emotional weight of the object. 3. Capacity versus assumption. A Boeing 727 can carry dozens of passengers. Yet many publicly circulated flight log entries list only a handful of names. This matters because public imagination often inflates scale. The aircraft's capacity creates the impression of mass gatherings. The documented entries do not consistently reflect that. They reflect variable passenger counts. Sometimes small, sometimes larger. But rarely full-capacity elite assemblies is often imagined. 4. The aircraft's later fate. Over time, Epstein transitioned away from the Boeing 727 and used other jets. The aircraft most associated with the nickname was eventually sold. But in public consciousness, the Boeing 727 remained frozen in scandal, even as operational reality moved forward. That freeze-frame effect distorts timelines. It compresses years of aviation history into a single symbol. The mythologizing of the aircraft explains why the timeline debate often feels larger than the logs themselves. Because once an object becomes symbolic, chronology competes with narrative. And narrative is louder. Every timeline tells two stories: what is documented, and what is missing. The publicly circulated Epstein flight logs are not a complete aviation archive. They represent specific aircraft, specific time windows, and specific documents introduced during litigation. That limitation is rarely emphasized, but it is crucial. Because once a document is treated as comprehensive, any absence becomes suspicious. And that is where speculation begins. 1. Fragmented documentation. The most widely shared logs primarily cover flights from the 1990s through the mid-2000s, especially those tied to the Boeing 727. But Epstein owned or used multiple aircraft over time. If a flight does not appear in the commonly circulated logs, that does not automatically mean it never occurred. It may simply mean it involved a different aircraft. It fell outside the documented timeframe. The record was not introduced in public litigation. The manifest was incomplete or redacted. A timeline built from partial records is, by definition, incomplete. That incompleteness must be acknowledged before drawing conclusions. 2. The illusion of definitive lists. Online discussions often treat the logs as if they are a definitive list of everyone who ever traveled with Epstein. They are not. They are a subset. And subsets create distortion in two directions. Names present are amplified. Names absent are assumed clean. Both assumptions exceed what the documents prove. A missing name is not an exoneration. A present name is not an indictment. The logs confirm transportation during recorded flights, nothing more. 3. Handwritten imperfections. Many entries were handwritten by pilots. Handwriting introduces variables, misspellings, abbreviations, initials, inconsistent formatting. In some cases, names are truncated or partially illegible. In others, only surnames appear. Context must be inferred cautiously. A timeline built on handwritten logs requires interpretive care, not narrative certainty. 4. The psychological effect of gaps. Gaps invite imagination. When a timeline has visible breaks, months without entries, aircraft transitions, incomplete manifests, the human mind seeks to fill them. In high-profile scandals involving wealth and power, those imagined fillers often become elaborate. But speculation does not equal documentation. A responsible reconstruction must differentiate confirmed flight from assumed movement. 5. The danger of overconfidence. One of the most striking features of public debate around Epstein's flights is certainty. People speak in absolutes. They all knew. They were all there. It's all in the logs. But the logs are finite, partial, and administrative. They are not diaries. They are not transcripts. They are not surveillance recordings. They are aviation records. Understanding their limits is not minimizing the case. It is respecting the boundary between documentation and inference. The timeline we have reconstructed so far is anchored in what is known. But to fully understand its significance, we must step back and ask, why did these flight logs become the central artifact of public obsession? More than financial documents, More than property records? More than even some court filings? By this point in the timeline, something unusual has happened. The flight logs, administrative aviation documents, have eclipsed far more detailed evidence in public conversation. Why? Because they are visible. They are concrete. They contain names. And in a scandal involving extreme wealth, global influence, and institutional failure, visible artifacts become emotional anchors. 1. Simplicity wins attention. Financial crimes require forensic accounting. Legal agreements require procedural understanding. Witness testimony requires context and nuance. A passenger list requires none of that. It presents a date, a route, a recognizable name. It is simple. And simplicity spreads faster than complexity. In the age of social media, a screenshot of a flight log circulates more easily than a 200-page court filing. The timeline became shareable. And shareable evidence becomes symbolic evidence. 2. The 2019 trust collapse. After Epstein's 2019 arrest, and especially after his death in custody, public trust in institutional transparency deteriorated sharply. Many people believed powerful individuals would never be held accountable. In that environment, the flight logs transformed. They no longer represented travel. They represented access. And access, in the public imagination, equals complicity. But that equation is psychological, not legal. 3. The visibility of names. A financial ledger listing anonymous shell corporations feels abstract. A flight manifest listing a former president or global celebrity feels immediate. That visibility is powerful. For example, entries involving Bill Clinton have been repeatedly cited in public debate. The presence of such a high-profile political figure gives the logs perceived gravity far beyond their technical function. Yet the logs themselves do not expand their narrative when a recognizable name appears. They do not change format. They do not provide context. The emotional weight comes from recognition, not from additional documentation. 4. The illusion of a closed system. The aircraft became imagined as a sealed world. A private space beyond accountability. But in operational reality, pilots recorded entries. Crew were present. Flights were filed. Airports logged arrivals. Private aviation is exclusive, but not invisible. The perception of invisibility amplified suspicion. 5. Why the timeline endures. Years later, the flight logs remain central to online discourse because they feel unresolved. They suggest proximity between power and scandal. They hint at networks. But they do not conclusively map wrongdoing. That tension, between implication and proof, keeps the timeline alive. It is incomplete enough to invite questions, concrete enough to avoid dismissal. And in a case defined by institutional controversy, that combination is combustible. We have traced the flights from the 1990s to 2019. We have examined patterns, gaps, myth, and symbolism. After reconstructing the flight timeline from the 1990s through 2019, several key lessons emerge about what these logs reveal, and what they do not. 1. Flights confirm presence, not knowledge. Every entry documents transportation, date, route, passenger names. Nothing in the logs confirms intent, awareness, or participation in criminal activity. A name on a manifest proves travel. It does not prove complicity. 2. Absence does not equal innocence. The logs are incomplete. They cover specific aircraft, specific timeframes, and specific events introduced in litigation. If someone does not appear in a log, it may reflect a different aircraft, a missing document, a flight outside the released period. Absence is not proof of lack of association. 3. Symbolism distorts perception. The nickname, Lolita Express, and the public's fascination with the Boeing 727 transformed administrative records into cultural symbols. Once a plane becomes a symbol, every passenger is scrutinized far beyond what the documents justify. Psychology, not the timeline itself, shapes perception. 4. Chronology matters. Interpretation must honor sequence. 1990s flights occurred before widespread public awareness. Early 2000s flights included some high-profile names, but not necessarily evidence of misconduct. Post-2008 travel occurred after the non-prosecution agreement. Post-2019 scrutiny retroactively amplified the significance of earlier flights. Understanding the context of each period is crucial to avoid retrospective distortion. 5. The limits of documentation. Flight logs are administrative tools. They document operational facts. They do not confirm behavior on board, provide personal communications, illustrate private activities at destinations. Overinterpreting them risks turning records into myth. 6. What the timeline ultimately reveals. The logs are most valuable as a window into Epstein's mobility, a record of routes connecting his residences, a reflection of social access and network infrastructure. They are less valuable as evidence of complicity, which requires corroborating testimony, financial data, or physical evidence. Conclusion. The Lolita Express timeline demonstrates a broader truth. Symbols often overshadow facts. Perception can outpace evidence. Documentation can inform, but also mislead, when stripped from context. By understanding both the content and limits of these logs, we gain insight into Epstein's movements without conflating pattern with proof. And that is the core lesson of the Lolita Express. Chronology, context, and critical analysis matter more than sensational assumptions. The documents exist. The questions remain. This channel will continue examining what is public, and what is still hidden. If you value documented analysis over speculation, consider subscribing. More files coming.